Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last messenger of Allah. Before going into the topic, from darkness into light, I would like to thank WAMI, the organization which, when I first went to Medina, myself and a couple of their American families who in difficult times received help, which made it possible for us to continue our studies there. Because at the time when we joined the university, they had no arrangements for married students. There were only dormitories for single students on campus, and that was it. Alhamdulillah, things have changed since then. They have all kinds of dormitories for married students now off campus. So, alhamdulillah, nobody has to face what we had to face. But at that time, that was a critical point in my journey to the understanding of Islam. A critical point which Allah knows best. Had that support not been there from the WAMI office in Riyadh, understanding our situation, Allah knows whether I would have managed to continue my studies or not, because I had an obligation to a family, a wife and a child. So that is a service which cannot be forgotten, and it's also evidence of WAMI's concern for students all over the world. In most countries that I've been to, I've seen evidence of their efforts. So I would encourage students here, the students from various backgrounds, to visit the office and take benefit from it and utilize its resources to help in conveying Islam and spreading its teachings in your individual countries. Okay. Last night at the lecture in the masjid, a question was raised at the end which asked about my route to Islam. And the organizers had forgotten or didn't realize that that's what I was supposed to talk about tonight. And I forgot also. I did tell people that it was possible for them to hear this story as I told it in Australia about 12 years ago. It was recorded and it's on YouTube, called My Way to Islam. So it wasn't really necessary for me to go into all the details. So I told about some of the basic stages that I traveled. The early stage, as I mentioned, I was raised a nominal Christian. Not that my parents thought we should just raise him as a nominal Christian, but that was just how young people at my time, in my time, were dealing with the church. It was nominally. I moved with my family to Malaysia when I graduated from high school. So like Barack Obama, I was here. As a non-Muslim, my family had moved to Sabah, Kota Kinabalu, and I went to school there. Because I'd already finished high school in Canada. My parents had me do A-levels, prepare for A-levels through distance learning. which was really a trial, something that I just really couldn't handle. I tried, but it just wasn't working. Anyway, most of my time was spent there enjoying myself. And this is the period of time when I got deeply into the music scene. I had a group, and we were known, or I was known at that time, as the Jimi Hendrix of East Malaysia. Jimi Hendrix being my idol of the time. So I had my bass player and drummer, and we used to do concerts, etc. there in East Malaysia. After a few years, I went back to Canada. My parents got me into Simon Fraser University in East Coast Canada, which accepted students with grade 12. The other parts of Canada required grade 13, but the new system, the American system, was beginning in Canada with only grade 12 and 4 years of university. So I went to Simon Fraser University, began studying biochemistry, and while studying there as a student, still playing music, I started to realize that there were some serious issues in the world. Right there in North America, I came to understand the plight of Black Americans, as well as Indian Americans, or Native Americans, what they're referred to now, American Indians. And I felt there was a need to change the situation. I wanted to make a better place, this world a better place. And what was being presented at the time at the university by the professors in sociology and psychology departments was communism. That was what was being offered. I started to read about it, and I accepted it. But during that period of time, I went back to Malaysia during the summer. And when I got back there, I found that my family, actually they told me about it, but I found this situation. My family had adopted an Indonesian boy. An Indonesian boy whose father was dead. Being an Indonesian, though born in East Malaysia, there was no future for him in higher studies. My mother felt she wanted to help him, and the only way that she could do so, to take him back to Canada to further his education, was to adopt him. And that was already a tradition in her side of the family. She already had like 4 or 5 adopted brothers and sisters. I mean, their family was still 5 or 6 people. Her mother just used to love to help others. So she adopted him into the family. So when I went back, I met him and stayed there throughout the summer. And I noticed that sometimes when I would go into his room, he had his own room, I would go into his room, I would find him on the ground with his head on the ground. Right? And I closed the door, went back out, you know. I talked to my brother and sister. I said, what's he doing? She said, we don't know. Yeah, sometimes we came in, we found him like that too. So we were just, wondering, what's going on? What is this? But we didn't ask him, and he never said anything. What happened was, we entered into, whilst I was still there, into Ramadan. Then we noticed Mom was getting up really early in the morning, and she was preparing food for him. So what's this? Why? My brothers and sisters, they didn't know. That's how it is. Every year around this time, it seems they do this. And my mother, we also noticed after Ramadan, I noticed anyway, my brothers and sisters, they noticed it earlier, they pointed out that every time Mom and Dad, whenever they had a meal, which was a meal using pork, right? She would cook fish for him. Why is that? He doesn't eat pork. Pork is a favorite food. North American food. Right? North Americans love the pig. Porky pig. Anyway, it was something strange. Couldn't figure it out. What was actually going on here? Anyway, my vacation was over. I went back to university, and in the Communist Party, we had a student revolt, shut down the university, took it over, police. Eventually, the university was reopened, back in classes. But I felt I really didn't need to be here anymore. So I just finished my third year. I left school, went down to the States, and linked up with the Communist Party down in the States in California, spent time there. Then moved back to Canada, but back to Toronto, which is where I was raised. And as I mentioned yesterday, I eventually became dissatisfied with communism. It didn't really seem to have the answers. Morally, I could see it was totally out to lunch. Engels were saying that the family is the place of oppression of women. It's better for people not to have families. Just males and females. We get carers to look after the kids. And so the relationships, families, people who already had families before they joined the party, etc., their families just broke up, fell apart. And I saw people were unscrupulous. I mean, it became clear to me. I remember one day after a rally in which we raised money for some political prisoners. And I needed to get some cigarettes. I didn't have enough money. I talked to one of the people that was handling the finances. I said, can you lend me some money? I need to buy some cigarettes. He said, no problem. They opened up the money which had been gathered and raised, for the political prisoners. Hey, I said, but that's their money, isn't it? It's for them. He said, no problem. We pay for our rent. Parties, no problem. I said, oof. I didn't like that really. But it was symptomatic. When I went back to Toronto, seeing what was happening with communism with regards to capitalism, communism was losing out. Capitalism was winning the battle, the economic world battle. It was a failure, communism. And reading the history Marx, Lenin, they were relatively okay, but when Stalin took over, millions massacred. Mao Zedong, millions massacred. Why? Bourgeoisie, you can't reform them. These are the enemies. The only way is to eliminate them. A very vicious, harsh system. So, as I mentioned before, at that period, a close friend of mine who was in the party with me, who was in fact actually a Maoist, that was the most strongest of the communist factions, memorized the Red Book of Mao Zedong. She accepted Islam. That just blew me away. Wow. How? Why? And she explained that it was not what I thought it was. Islam is different. It's not like the other religions, etc., etc. So I started to read. And then I told you yesterday that after reading the book of Muhammad Qutb, I was convinced, intellectually, that Islam was the way. But spiritually, I had denied that there was a God for about 4 years by then. There is no God. Even before that, I said, growing up, I mean, even as a Christian, I really didn't think too much about God. I mean, it was just, we'd hear God, but usually it's like, God damn it, you know. That's where we heard it most, right? But now this was an issue. If I was to become a Muslim, I had to address this issue. I really didn't know where to go on this. I talked with some people who were already converts around me, but I wasn't convinced spiritually. What happened was the commune I was living in, you know, as communists, we were living in communes, meaning that it's a communal house. We rented a house together, everybody just has a room in there, a common kitchen everybody uses, you know, males, females, everybody's in their individual rooms. And in my room, I used to have a library. I used to read a lot, so I collected a lot of books. And because when you live communally, you know, people go in and use other people's stuff, because we looked at it like, even though it was officially mine, it was everybody's. So people used to come into my room and borrow books. Or they would sit at a table and chair and eat. And read the books. Then one day, when I had gone into the room, I'd lay down on the bed to go to sleep. And there were a couple of people had come in, were reading at the desk. I was slipping into sleep, but still aware of the room. So sort of halfway between sleep and waking. And whilst I was in that state, I could see myself walking with a bike, because I used to ride a bike, walking with my bike to this, what looked like a warehouse, a door. And I walked into the warehouse. The warehouse was pitch black, dark. I kept walking in. And as I walked in, further and further, I would always turn back and check to see, is the door still open? Further I went, the smaller the door got. The light outside. It was getting smaller and smaller. But somehow I was just driven to keep going in. Until, as you can imagine, I reached the point where I turned back and there was no light. I was in pitch darkness. At that point, this fear came over me, which I had never experienced in my life before. It was a fear which just shook me to the root of my soul, really. I felt death, that I was dying. If I didn't get out of this place, I would never get out. That's what went through my mind. So I started to scream for help. Because somehow, in spite of all of this darkness and everything, I could still see those people sitting at the table. So I was calling out to them to help me. But in that state, and I've spoken to people, other people at different times, where they've found themselves in a similar state. At this point, when I tried to scream, words just wouldn't come out of my mouth. They were just stuck in my throat. No sounds would come out. I was screaming in my brain, but nothing was coming out of my mouth. They couldn't hear me. I did that for a bit, and then I realized that it was all over. They couldn't help me. I couldn't get myself out. I was finished. So I just gave up. That's it. It's all over. When I gave up like that, I woke up. Oof, sat up in my bed. Wow, that was really a shock. Really a shock. You know, I sat there for a bit and I was just thinking. I said, wow, what was that? And then it hit me, you know, hey, the people in the room couldn't help you. You couldn't help yourself. So, who got me out of this? Obviously, it was somebody beyond me. Beyond the people in the room along with me. And this is when I started to feel a sense of God being there. So that was my, you could say, spiritual experience, which opened me up then to say, yeah, let me go ahead with this and become a Muslim. So I told my friends who had become Muslims, yeah, I want to become a Muslim now. So they did the ceremony of Shahada, declaring faith, declared my faith. Okay, what do I have to do now? You got to pray. Okay, so how do we pray? So they told me, you stand up and you have to say these things. They wrote it out on a piece of paper for me. And then you say Allahu Akbar and you bow and you stand back up again. And then you prostrate on the ground. I said, hey, what's that? Yeah, this is what we do. We Muslims do it. I said, what? That's what my brother is, that adopted brother of mine. He's a Muslim. He's been a Muslim there with us all these years. I was shocked. By then, my parents had come back to Canada, and they were in Ottawa, the capital, and he was out there going to university. Immediately after I finished learning the Salah, I got on the next train out to Ottawa. So I went there and came to the house, and the first person I met, my brother had come, he'd opened the door. He opened the door, I said, stepped in. I said, you're a Muslim? He said, yeah. Well, I'm a Muslim too. He said, oh, that's great, you know. I said, what are you, all these years that you were with us and you never said anything about this. You never told us about Islam. How could you do that, man? He said, well, you know, I didn't feel good to try to explain Islam to the family because your parents had done so much for me. You know, I didn't want to introduce anything which would create confusion or bad feelings or, you know, disruption to the family. And so I said, I couldn't say anything. I said, no, that's not right. You had to say something, man, regardless of what the consequence was going to be. You couldn't have left us all these years and not say anything. I was really upset. Eventually I calmed down and, okay, right, all right. What to do? Alhamdulillah, I found Islam. Better late than never. So I informed my parents, and unlike what happens to many converts, my parents were quite happy. They were quite happy with my acceptance of Islam. Obviously, my mom knew about Islam. Both my mother and father knew about it because this getting up for suhoor and preparing, for her to do that, she had to know about Islam. Preparing fish instead of pork, and she had an idea. In fact, she had studied something about Islam. She had taken a course in Toronto, University of Toronto. She had taken a course when she was doing her master's. Taken a course in, what did they call it? World religions, maybe it was called then, or comparative religion, something like this. Anyway, she told me, and she even had the books, still had the books, I took them. She told me that, she used to attend this class, and the class, when she studied the class on Islam, she took the course on Islam, she found that the professor was attacking Islam in every single issue. Every issue he would bring up about Islam, he would attack it. Look at these people, and this, and... So she felt something's not right here, So eventually she stood up in class and she said, listen, if there is nothing good in this religion, then what are we taking it for? What are we studying it for? I said, well, this is a requirement of the university, blah, blah, blah. But she wasn't happy. She went back to the library and she chose her own books to read. Instead of what he had prescribed, she went and found some other books. The History of Islam by Hitti, Lebanese Christian, Arab, but he presented Islam in a relatively neutral way. He presented the facts. So she came to understand Islam in a different light. And she would go back into the classroom, and when the teacher was making his negative comments, she would question and raise other issues. She was challenging him in the class. And every class became an argument. And she didn't get top marks on her assignments. She was passed. She did pass with a B. She should have been really an A student. And later, she came to understand the professor was a Jewish professor. You see? He's a Jewish professor teaching Islam. Or as we say, teaching Mislam. Right? Anyway, the point is that she had this exposure, she had shared that with my father, so they had this background, this understanding. When they moved to Malaysia, they already had a background of the belief system, people, etc., etc. And they were, as I said, then accepting of me choosing to become a Muslim. Because at least now, from in case of my mother, at least now you believe in God and you're worshiping God. It's a good thing. And for my father, because he had been a socialist when in his own youth, realized the weaknesses much earlier. And we used to have arguments at the dinner table all the time. So now the arguments were over. So everything was peaceful. He was fine with it. And I was happy, family was happy with me accepting Islam. After accepting Islam, as I told you yesterday, I had gone through this experience when I started to seek knowledge of Islam. An experience which led me to conclude that the only place that I'm going to be able to get correct and accurate knowledge of Islam would be back to the sources, where Islam came from, Arabia. Let me go to Medina. I got a scholarship, I went there and began to study. So I studied, finished off my BA there in Medina, and during the course of my studies, my family moved to other parts of the world. My father and mother, they moved to northern Nigeria, and they taught there. They're both teachers, trainers of teachers, teacher trainers. They were there for a couple of years. They went to Yemen and taught in Yemen, South Yemen. And I had seen an ad in a newspaper for a job of setting up a school. Actually, it was an English medium international school in Riyadh. And I passed the ad on to my parents, and they got the job. They went up to Riyadh and they set up an international, actually it turned out this international Islamic school. They set up the boys and girls sides. So when I finished my studies in Medina, I went out to Riyadh to do my master's. I was invited by my father to come and teach Islamic studies at the boys' side of the school. The school was known as Manarat Riyadh Schools. And that was a new challenge for me. The knowledge I had gained, I had to now translate it into the teaching media. I wasn't really a teacher. I got tips from my parents, how to organize lessons and these types of things, and I began the process of teaching. Now, during this period of time, actually, from the time I accepted Islam, I had tried to convince my parents to become Muslims. I tried, talked to them, tried to do whatever research I could in Christianity, etc. During this period, my father told me, actually, from the time I was 14 years old, I stopped believing that Jesus was God. His father was a minister in the church, Presbyterian minister. So he was raised in that religious environment. But when he went to school, did a little bit of study of logic, he concluded that Jesus could not possibly have been God. So he, from that point onwards, from the time he was 14, he only prayed to God alone, who was known as God the Father. His brothers and sisters used to call him the atheist, because for them, if you didn't believe Jesus was God, then you don't believe in God. So he had carried that all the way along. And then I understood why he never used to go to church. My mom used to go and take us kids, but Dad never used to go. So that was where that was coming from. Anyway, so he was pretty close, and so I tried to work on him, but it didn't work. Whatever I tried, discussions, etc., they said, Islam is a good religion, we can appreciate it, we respect it. Most of our best friends are Muslims. That's enough for us. Okay, they're happy. So that's how things continued. At one point, while they were in Saudi Arabia, I had finished off my master's, and I had prepared a booklet really, for explaining Islam to non-Muslims. It was called The True Religion of God. I'd given it as a lecture in a football field of Filipinos, and after the lecture, about 20 of them accepted Islam, and I transcribed the lecture and wrote it up as a booklet, and it was printed, tens of thousands, translated to different languages, and became one of the most popular books in Saudi Arabia for dawah. Anyway, after a few years, a couple of years, I felt that the book needed to be rewritten because it was transcribed from a lecture. And the way you speak is really different from the way that you write. Right? So, although I had done some editing, I wanted to rewrite it. So I began and rewrote the whole book as a booklet. After I'd finished, I took it to my parents. And I said to them, listen, you know, I'm going to publish this, republish this booklet. Could you go over it for me, please? You know, edit it. My dad was an English specialist, master's in English. And mom, her English is very good. So I said, could you please go over it for me? And anything you find in it which is not correct, of course, grammar, catch my grammar, whatever. But even the ideas, the concepts, if it's not clear, you know, I'm making illogical conclusions, whatever, let me know. So I gave it to them. They went through it. I came back, asked them. They said, okay, this you need to change, this. Okay, I said, fine. I went, changed it. Brought it back again. They went through it again. Yeah, it's good now. So I say, okay, there's nothing wrong in it. Everything is clear. And he said, yeah, it's fine now. So I said, so why don't you accept Islam? They smiled. Said, okay, give us a Quran. So I gave them a Quran to read. Another year passed, and they went back to Canada. And at that point, I went to the UAE. And I went to Canada from the UAE to visit them. And about the day after I got there, my mother came to me and said, I want to accept Islam. I said, Alhamdulillah. She said, listen, don't tell your father. I want him to make his own decision, right? To decide for himself. The next morning, he came to me and said, I want to accept Islam. So that was the high point in my life, because having given da'wah, I told you about it yesterday, we were in the Eastern Province, 3,000 troops accept Islam, people accepted Islam all around us, and then my own parents, it's tough. Anyway, I asked my mom afterwards, I said, what caused you to make this decision after all this time, and why did you decide? She said, you remember when you came to visit me in Jeddah? They had moved down to Jeddah. And I told you that there was something in the house. I'd gone and visited her in Jeddah. And she felt there was something in the house. She said, she would look and there would be something would move, and she'd, what is this? What's going on here? So what she did was she knitted a cross. She knitted a cross, right? And she put it over her doorway. but it was still there. So when I came down to visit, she told me about it. She said, this. So I said, okay, give me that Quran that I gave you. And I read Surah Al-Baqarah, second chapter of the Quran, the whole surah there. Okay? And this is what the Prophet ﷺ had said, that it will drive out the evil forces, the jinn, what the West call ghosts and things like this. So I recited it, I read it, and then I left. And actually it just went from my mind after that. But she said, when you left, it stopped. It wasn't there anymore. She had knitted the cross, it didn't work. You read the Quran, and it worked. She said, okay. That caught her, as giving some additional support to Islam being the right choice. So, alhamdulillah, that, as I mentioned to you, was the high point in my life at that time, parents accepting Islam. In the UAE, I began to teach, finished off my PhD in Wales, began to teach in the American University in Dubai, in the UAE. And I taught there basically for 10 years and set up a Dawah center called the Islamic Information Center in Dubai. Alhamdulillah, quite a few hundred people accepted Islam from that center over the years. And in the beginning of 2000, I set up a department of Islamic studies at a university in Ajman. I left the American University because I wasn't getting the opportunity to set up a department, so I set up this department in Islamic Studies in Preston University, Ajman. I hired staff and we began teaching Islamic studies there. I prepared a curriculum based on what I'd studied in Medina. I looked at what was there in Azhar, in Durman Islamic University, looked at the universities that were around, and tried to put together the most comprehensive syllabus for the BA studies there. After a couple of years teaching in that program, I moved to Qatar. And there I tried to set up something similar, wasn't able. In 2007, I set up a program of BA studies connected as distance studies with Durman Islamic University. So the degree was issued for those students from Durman Islamic University in the Sudan. And at the same time that I did that, I started a diploma program online. I set up this university program, Islamic Online University, as training, preparing to actually launch a full-scale BA, MA, PhD program online. So it was sort of like a training period. So we started with short courses, something like the Al-Kawthar, Maghrib courses, 10, 15 lectures long. And I offered it free. And that was something I didn't realize how much people wanted access to this knowledge, that within the first year we had 1,500 students. By the second year we had 4,500. Third year we hit 10,000 plus students. By the fourth year we had hit 35,000 students. The numbers were just, exploding. And we had a greater and greater reach. And so this is the program which was introduced to you, the diploma program, where all of the courses are absolutely free. And there are no requirements to get in, no age requirements, no certificate requirements, nothing. You register, get your code, and go ahead and study. What you want to study, when you want to study, how you want to study it. It's all there. And last year, we began the BA program. And the slogan of Islamic University is basically changing the nation through education. Because the issue of da'wah, calling people to Islam, is something that has always been dear to me. You know, despite teaching in university, etc., I was always involved on the ground, explaining Islam, whether it's in university settings, institutes, etc., clarifying mainly misconceptions that people have about it, you know, presenting the message of Islam clearly, especially to Westerners, people from Western-influenced cultures. So the BA program was begun last year. However, the BA program, because of the fact now that we had to have times, you can't run it like the way we were doing the diploma program. We had to have requirements. People had to be at least high school. And we had to have a registrar who was full-time, etc. So because we had to hire people now, the diploma program has basically about 25 volunteers from around the world. They're wherever they are. They work online, so everything is functioning completely online. For the BA program, of course, now we had to make hard copies of documents and create files and all these other kinds of things. So some cost had to come up. So we introduced a registration and examination fee. But the course fees, no course fees. People can study as many courses as you want. It's the same. Each semester would be, depending on where you are, according to the UNESCO breakdown of nations, underdeveloped, developed, highly developed, etc., we gave scales from $20 to $60. $60 if you're in the US, $20 if you're in Africa, India. This is the scale that we developed. And alhamdulillah, that a lot of people have responded to it and are signing up and studying. And this we wanted to share with you this evening, that you pass this information on to others. Those of you that are studying in other fields, you can take individual courses. You don't necessarily have to take the whole BA course. You can take part of the subject, some subjects that you're interested in. But I just wanted to stress to you the importance of Islamic knowledge, that you must access it regardless of the field that you're in. Whether you're in engineering or medicine or mathematics, teaching, whatever, as Muslims, we should have sufficient knowledge of Islam to guide us in our various fields. This much knowledge is compulsory. If you're a cab driver, then you need to know the knowledge that Islam has, which deals with being a cab driver. Can you pick somebody up who's got a case of beer in his hand? Can you transport this person? Islamically, is it permissible? You should know. I mean, being a cab driver doesn't mean you're exempt. There should be a difference between a Muslim cab driver and a non-Muslim cab driver. As a Muslim cab driver, there are guidelines that you have to follow. As a non-Muslim, there are none. Just whatever the law says, you must do this, you can't do that, whatever. But beyond the overall governmental laws, for a Muslim, we have the Sharia. The Sharia, which touches every aspect of our lives. So whatever we have to do, regardless of our professions, our circumstances, it is an obligation on each and every one of us, a religious obligation, to have sufficient knowledge to do whatever is required of us in a way which is pleasing to God. That's the bottom line. What I need to know, you don't necessarily need to know. What you need to know, I don't necessarily need to know. But each and every one of us has a certain amount of knowledge that we must know. I mean, there's some basic knowledge that we all share. The 5 pillars of Islam, 6 pillars of Iman, that's basics. But beyond that, in terms of how we live our lives, then there are various areas of knowledge which we must access in order to live our lives correctly, according to the instruction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, when He said, قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Say, indeed my prayers, my fasting, my living, and my dying are for Allah, the Lord of all the worlds. For our lives to be truly for Allah, we must follow the Sharia. Whether the country follows it properly or whatever or not, we as individuals are required to follow it to whatever degree it is possible. We can't say, well, no, the government doesn't do it. They don't insist. It's their fault if they're not applying it. No, that's not acceptable. As much as you are able to do without breaking what is considered to be the law, then you, as an individual, will have to answer before God whether you obeyed Him in this life or not. So, that was my journey, and this is my mission, and I hope, inshallah, that many of you would share in this, whether by joining the university programs, the free ones or the BA ones, or at least passing that information on to others who may benefit if you can't. So, I think we've come around now to question and answer time.